So we are on example 6. Okay. So now let's graph the function f of x is equal to negative cosine of pi x minus 6. Okay, so now we're graphing a cosine function. So real quick, let's just recall what the cosine function looks like. So down here, I'm just going to do the basic function. F of x is equal to cosine of x. Okay. So remember the cosine function, it also has a period of 2 pi. So our full cycle will go from 0 to 2 pi. And our maximum value is up here at 1. Our minimum value is at negative 1. Remember, for the cosine function, instead of starting at the origin, we actually start up here on the y-axis. And then, let's break up our x-axis as well, as we always do. Halfway between 0 and 2 pi is pi. Halfway between 0 and pi is pi over 2. And over here we have 3 pi over 2. And the pattern for the cosine function is we start up here at 1, we come down to the x-axis, or the midline, we come down to negative 1, back up to the x-axis, and we'll end up at positive 1 again. And the shape of our graph looks kind of like this. Right? It looks like a sine wave. We're kind of just shifted over a little bit. The main thing to notice is that instead of starting at the origin, we start up here at this point. Okay, so now let's identify some aspects of this function here, and then we'll start to graph it. So let's start with, how about the phase shift? Because that tells us where we're going to start our cycle. And notice I'm not adding or subtracting anything to x. Our phase shift is just 0. Okay. What about our period? So our formula for period is 2 pi over b, where b is just that number in front of x. So what we have is 2 pi divided by, b here is pi. 2 pi divided by pi is just 2. Okay. Let's also identify what is our midline. So that's given to us by our vertical translation, which in this case is minus 6. So we're going to shift everything down 6 units. Our midline is the horizontal line, y equals negative 6. And then our amplitude, remember to find our amplitude, we just look at that coefficient in front of our function, so negative 1. But of course the amplitude has to be positive, so we're going to take the absolute value of negative 1, which gives us positive 1. Okay. Now let's start to graph our function. And this time, because I know that the whole graph is getting shifted down 6 units, I'm going to give myself some more room below the x-axis. Okay. And let's label our x-axis. So our phase shift is 0, so that means we're going to start, well, that's not necessarily our point, but we know we are going to start on the y-axis there. Okay. And where is our cycle going to end? Well, our period is actually now 2. So if we start at 0, we're going to end at just 2. And I have to break up this interval from 0 to 2 into 4 equal segments. So I know halfway in the middle is 1, halfway between 0 and 1 is 1/2, and halfway between 1 and 2 would be 1.5, or if you like fractions, that would be 3/2. Okay. Let's also draw that midline of y equals negative 6. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Y equals negative 6. Okay. And now let's start actually drawing the 5 points to help us graph our function. And so remember the cosine function, it starts above our midline. But in this case, notice that our coefficient in front is negative, which means that we have a reflection. Instead of starting above the midline, we're actually going to start below. And how far below? Well, just 1 unit below, because our amplitude is 1. So this down here would be a y value of negative 7, because our midline is at negative 6. Okay. Also, we know we're going to go 1 unit above the midline as well, which would be negative 5. Okay. So now let's start plotting the actual function. Our first point, again, because of our reflection, we're going to start down here at negative 7. And then at x equals 1/2, we'll come up to the midline. At x equals 1, we'll come up to our maximum value at -5. At 3/2, we'll come back to the midline. And at x equals 2, we'll come back to our minimum value at -7. And now if we connect these points and make it look like a sine wave while we do that, we get something roughly of that shape. Of course, it continues to the right and left forever. And one last thing, let's just write down the domain and range. So again, domain for all these functions, it's always all real numbers. And our range, what's our range? Lowest y value is -7, and our highest y value is -5. And there we go.